Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 42nd and final chapter of Book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. Turning away from the door to the cellar, Maddie moved to the left-hand entrance, which, from her previous reconnaissance, she knew opened into the tunnel that would take her to the South Tower. She was accustomed now to moving through the tunnels, with their uneven footing, low headroom, and dim light, and she made good time, following the pool of light thrown by her lantern. She shook it again, checking the level of oil left in the reservoir. Satisfied that there was still plenty remaining, she continued on through the tunnel. "Wouldn't want to be in here if the light went out," she muttered. Just to be sure, she lowered the wick a little so that it would burn less fuel. The tunnel was relatively straight and undeviating, and she soon felt it sloping upward, and knew she was close to the base of the South Tower, and the wooden ladders that led up to the top floors. Eventually, they loomed out of the dimness ahead of her. She paused at the base of the first flight, studying the rungs to make sure they were solid, and then she began to climb. The flights weren't vertical, but they were steep, angling up at about 70 degrees. Each one consisted of 15 rungs, steps, actually, as they were constructed from stout boards some 12 centimeters across. At the top of each flight, she could step across to the next 15 steps, angling back in the opposite direction. 2 flights took her up 1 story in the tower, so she calculated she would have 18 flights to climb before she reached the top. She grimaced at the thought. She was fit and young, and she'd manage the climb easily. But 18 flights of steps? Luckily, her hip was only a problem if she sat still for a long period of time. "That's something to be grateful for," she muttered to herself. At first, she moved steadily, not rushing, checking each step before she trusted her weight to it. 1 or 2 creaked and moved slightly, but for the most part, they were solidly set and in good condition. As she continued without finding a problem, her confidence grew, and she began to climb faster, which, inevitably, nearly brought her to disaster. 1 tread on the 5th flight had rotted at the point where it was set into the upright section of the ladder. As she put her weight on it and began to step upward, it crumbled and splintered and gave way. She grabbed at the side rail desperately as her foot dropped into empty space. For a moment she hung, nearly losing her grip on the lantern. Then she recovered, and setting her teeth, hauled herself up past that broken step to the next above it. This time she tested it carefully, before committing her full weight to it. And this time it held. But the near accident made her more careful, and she slowed down again, testing each step. 10 flights, 11, 12. She was counting each stage as she went, saying the words in a whisper. 6 flights to go, she thought, stopping at the small platform between flights to stretch her leg and work her knees. She looked up, seeing a few faint rays of light above her, where ventilation or observation holes were let into the outer walls of the tower. She looked down. Below her was only a black void, and for a moment her head swam. Halfway up the 13th flight, she paused, sniffing the still air inside the stairway. She could smell smoke. Not wood smoke, she realized. It had an oily smell to it, like pitch. She felt a moment of panic. Had Damone managed to set fire to the tower? Had her mother and her troops been driven out and captured? Or worse? There was only one way to find out. That was to continue upward. She started climbing again. On the next flight, she became conscious of a banging sound echoing down the stairway. The regular rhythm sounded like hammers hitting wood. "Someone's building something," she thought. The sound comforted her. If there was activity above, then it indicated that her mother was still secure in the tower, and that her fears when she smelled the smoke were unfounded. The hammering grew louder the farther up she went. The smoky smell was still evident, but she could see no flicker of light above her that might indicate that something was still burning, and there was no physical evidence of smoke itself, no fumes or choking clouds. Whatever it was that had been burning, it was no longer a light. 15. 16. The hammering was louder now. Halfway up the 17th flight, she stopped and pressed her ear to the stone wall. The hammering was coming from the other side, almost level with her current position. She continued until she was at the top of the 18th flight, facing the stone wall. Holding the lantern, she stopped to catch her breath and study the wall. She could see the rectangular outline of the door and the simple handle halfway down. There was no need for concealment or secrecy inside the hidden staircase. Just above her eye level, there was a small hole, made obvious by the gleam of light showing from the other side. She raised herself on tiptoe and peered through. Her heart leapt as she saw Cassandra sitting not 5 meters away, her back to the secret door where Maddie stood. Her mother was talking to a gray-bearded sergeant in the uniform of the palace guard. His arm was in a sling, and they were seated at a wooden table in the big, well-lit room that took up most of the 9th floor. She reached out for the door handle. Cassandra was sitting at the large table on the 9th floor, drinking a cup of coffee when Merlin entered. "The barrier is almost ready, my lady," he said, indicating the hammering that came from below with a jerk of his head. Cassandra nodded. "Good. That'll stop any further attempt to burn us out. Sit down, Merlin. Pour yourself a cup of coffee." Taking a leaf out of Damon's book, she had set her men to constructing a wooden wall at the edge of the gap in the stairway. That would prevent their attackers from hurling more of the clay pots filled with burning pitch up at the defenders. The pots would hit the wall and fall harmlessly into the stairwell below. The timber wall itself would be doused regularly with water to forestall any attempt to burn it. She leaned back and stretched. She was tired, and her shoulders and neck ached with tension. "Well, I suppose there's not much—" She stopped as she heard a loud click from behind her. As she was turning to see what had caused it, a familiar voice spoke. "Hello, Mum." Cassandra gave a cry of shock, rapidly turning to delight. Maddie, dressed in her ranger cloak and uniform, stood by the wall in front of an open doorway. Merlin grunted in surprise, and Cassandra, recovering quickly, rose to her feet and dashed to her daughter, folding her into a bear hug. "Maddie! Oh, Maddie! You're safe! Thank goodness!" Maddie laughed with a combination of relief and joy, half smothered in her mother's embrace. Finally, she managed to break free, just a little. Not too much, just a little. Cassandra held her back at arm's length, satisfying herself that her daughter was unharmed, tears of happiness coursing down her cheeks. "Where on earth did you spring from? Where have you been? Are you all right?" Yes, I'm fine, Mother. I discovered a whole network of tunnels and secret stairways inside the walls and under the castle itself." She stepped aside, indicating the dark opening behind her. "This leads down to the cellars." "The cellars? What were you doing in the cellars?" her mother wanted to know. "The tunnels all start from down there," Maddie explained. But the explanation left a lot unanswered. Tunnels? Stairways? Secret passages? What have you been doing? Maddie took both her mother's hands in her own to calm her. The sudden shock of seeing her daughter, of realizing she was safe, after wondering where she was too much for Cassandra. She began to sob. Merlin, horrified at the sight of his calm, self-assured princess losing control of her emotions, stood awkwardly, wanting to help, but not knowing how. Maddie reassured him with a glance. "Maybe you could make us some more coffee, Sergeant?" she suggested. And as he hurried away to do so, she led Cassandra back to her chair. "Now, Mother, sit down. Calm down, and I'll tell you everything." It took 15 minutes, with constant interruptions and questions from Cassandra, for Maddie to describe the events of the previous few days. When she heard that Horace was safe, although besieged in the hill fort north of the Wesel River, Cassandra felt a huge weight lifted from her shoulders. "Damone tried to tell me he was dead," she said, her voice full of venom. Maddie shook her head. "He's safe, but he'll find it hard to break out. He's outnumbered, and the enemy can see everything he does. He can't surprise them. I thought if I could get some men and stage a surprise attack on the enemy from the rear, that would give him a chance to break out." Cassandra considered the idea. "It would work," she said. "But where would you find the men?" Maddie shrugged. "I thought maybe I could mobilize the army," she said. The castle only maintained a small regular garrison. The army was made up of men-at-arms, knights, and foot soldiers from the surrounding farms and villages, who could be called upon in the event of war or other danger. Cassandra shook her head. "It'd take too long to gather them," she said, "and Damone would quickly get wind of what you were doing." She stood up and began pacing the room, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We can hold out here indefinitely," she said, "but what we need to do is find a way to break your father and Gillen out of this hill fort. Then, if they march south and hit Damone from behind, we can break out of here at the same time and attack him from both sides." "You say there's a tunnel into the gatehouse?" she asked, and Maddie nodded. "Then you could lower the drawbridge and let Horace and Gillen's men in." She turned, pacing again, her mind working overtime. "But if you're going to have to launch a surprise attack on the force holding Horace and Gillen, you'll need men. Good fighting men. The kind who will put the fear of the devil into those Red Fox scum." Her voice trailed off as she racked her brains for an idea. Then her brow cleared, and she looked at her daughter with a wide smile on her face. "And I think I know just the men you need," she said. All right, that is going to bring us to the conclusion of Chapter 42 and also the entire book of the Red Fox Clan. Thank you all for joining me as we read through this book. I know I really enjoyed reading it, and I hope that you all enjoyed listening. And with that being said, I'll see you guys next time in Book 3 of the Royal Ranger series, The Duel at Araluen. God bless, and have a good one.